In this entry of our retrospective, we're looking at the villains featured in Alice in Wonderland. We've got a lot to cover here, so I'll just jump right into the movie's origins. Disney's Alice in Wonderland is based on two books by Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from 1865, and Through the Looking Glass from 1871. Both stories feature a young girl, Alice, finding her way into a mysterious location that runs on its own logic, or lack thereof. She mingles with the strange inhabitants, and then finds herself back in reality on the last couple pages. The books are not well remembered for their plots, but rather for the weird and wonderful moments throughout. Walt Disney had his eye on the story since he began working in animation. Some of his earliest shorts featured a young girl named Alice exploring cartoon worlds, but they didn't have much to do with the books otherwise. Several ideas and drafts for the movie were played with as early as 1933, some receiving extensive concept art and story treatments. Storyboards by David Hall from 1939, for example, show a truly nightmarish take on Wonderland. If this was the Alice the public received, then Pinocchio might not be regarded as the most traumatic Disney movie. As wonderfully detailed and expressive as this concept art is, I'm thankful that Disney chose to go in a zanier direction. At the same time, part of me can't help but wonder how this darker take on the movie would have turned out if it had been animated. Several commenters have asked me who I will and won't classify as villains in this movie, since most of the characters featured are unpleasant and unhelpful to Alice. That, and the movie is very episodic, with most characters popping in and out with no real bearing on the plot. That's not to say it's a bad movie. In fact, it's a lot of fun. But it's true that it's not exactly conventional. Alice's goal at first is to follow the White Rabbit. Eventually, she gets fed up with Wonderland, and her goal becomes to find her way home. In her journeying, she meets some very unpredictable characters. They are all prone to mood swings, and quickly jump between being Alice's friend or foe. An argument could be made that many of the characters could be seen as somewhat villainous, or that none could be truly classified as bad guys. For the sake of this video, I am focusing on the Queen of Hearts, the Cheshire Cat, the Walrus, and the Carpenter. Several Alice characters are taken from old nursery rhymes, and some of them are better remembered today for their appearances in the Wonderland stories. The Queen of Hearts comes from a poem of the same name that goes, "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole the tarts, and took them clean away. The King of Hearts called for the tarts, and beat the knave full sore. The Knave of Hearts brought back the tarts, and vowed he'd steal no more." Since the worlds Alice travels to are seen through the eyes of a child, it's natural that the characters a child would be familiar with would appear. The Queen of Hearts is met in the final third of the original Alice book. All the citizens of Wonderland fear her, because her solution to any problem that arises is to point at the apparent culprit and shout, "Off with his head." Either that, or they are sent to the dungeon. Shortly before the Queen makes her grand entrance, Alice meets a trio of playing card guards who are frantically painting some white roses red. The Queen likes red roses, but they planted white ones by mistake, and the Queen isn't the forgiving type. Or rather, she's the kind of person who might have an easier time forgiving the offending party if they were decapitated first. Aside from her classic off-with-his-head order, the Queen's other passion is playing a Wonderland version of croquet, using hedgehogs as balls, flamingos as mallets, and her card guards as arches. Later, a trial is held place where the Knave of Hearts is accused of stealing tarts, like in the poem. Whether he did or didn't do it remains a mystery, since all the evidence presented is nonsensical, like everything else in Wonderland. Alice grows more and more fed up while observing the trial. When the girl calls out everyone on their infuriating nonsense, the cards attack her, and she wakes up. The Queen is largely defined by her temper, while the King is nicer. Notably, he discreetly pardons the cards sentenced to be beheaded behind the Queen's back. It's implied this happens all the time. Alice is even told that the Queen really loves ordering the sentences, and doesn't really care whether or not they're carried out. After all, if she really did get her way, she would run out of victims very quickly. Why the Wonderlanders still genuinely seem to fear her is a bit of a mystery, but the book runs on illogic, so any plot holes are easily excused. Indeed, for all her bluster, at least some of the Queen's actual power is only on the surface. When she orders Alice's head chopped off upon meeting the child, Alice says the Queen is speaking nonsense, and the Queen goes silent. She doesn't know how to react to anyone actually standing up to her. The King is even more ineffectual, timidly hiding behind Alice when the Cheshire Cat's head appears floating in the air. Although the courtroom sequence makes for a fun finale, the King and Queen of Hearts are really just as harmless as the rest of the crazy Wonderlanders. In the Disney movie, although the episodic nature of the book was retained, they knew they had to have an exciting climax, so the Queen was boosted from a loud windbag into an actual threat. The proposed David Hall draft of the movie would have informed us of how bad the Queen is right away. While falling, Alice would encounter a group of bats who warn her not to go any farther, saying that the queen would try to kill her. They would try to stop Alice from falling, but the annoyed girl threatens to call her cat Dinah on them and continues down the rabbit hole. When Alice gets to the courtyard, the White Rabbit heralds the queen in with a fanfare. She apparently does not like his playing and shoves him aside to play the fanfare herself. We then see her whole royal procession, including a large and intimidating executioner. The movie was always meant to end with a trial, it would appear, but it was much scarier in the David Hall draft, like everything else. The trembling Knave of Hearts is seen on the stand. He is found guilty and not beheaded, but blown up by a cannon. Alice is next on the chopping block and runs for it, but finds herself at a dead end in the dungeon. She is strapped under the guillotine and wakes up just as the blade comes down. As I said before, the concept art alone is remarkably frightening, and it's not hard to picture movie theaters full of crying kids. For this particular version, it was suggested that the Queen of Hearts be played by Lucille Laverne, who had previously played the Wicked Queen in Snow White. Another proposed storyline that came later on had Alice trying to rescue the Knave of Hearts, who she had fallen in love with. The Queen, acting more like the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz, would try to distract Alice from her journey with the various Mad Wonderland denizens. This was all in an effort to give the episodic story a more concise plot, which was obviously dropped in the end. The final version of the Queen audiences received was a good mix of funny and threatening. She's quick-tempered, but she seems to enjoy being angry to some extent, since it means she can punish whoever has wronged her, or whoever she happens to glance at first. The mix of rage and delight can be seen right away when she notices the red paint on her roses. As she marches forward to inspect them, her scowl turns to a sneer of delight. Someone is definitely about to lose their head. With the Queen is the King of Hearts, who commands none of the respect his wife does. When the Queen is announced, she receives enthusiastic cheers from the crowd. The King needs to remind the White Rabbit to announce him as well, to which he gets a singular cheer. Clearly, the King is just as much a follower to the Queen as the other subjects are. He is much less imposing than her, and has no fear-based authority. Still, he's not all that much better than the Queen, eagerly attempting to enforce her rulings. He does suggest a trial for Alice, but it seems more like he wants to have one for fun rather than to help the girl. The best that can be said about the King and Queen of Hearts is that they do genuinely seem to love each other. The King might be the only character the Queen regularly shows real affection toward. That has to count for something. The Queen has a seemingly endless army of playing cards serving as her guards. As Alice finds out, they might be nothing but a pack of cards, but the number of them is ultimately what makes them threatening. You can scatter a few, but more and more will spring up. As I said, all the guards live in fear of the Queen, but they're quick to rejoice in the misfortune of anyone who is sentenced to death. Since any moment could be their last, I guess they have to find some joy in throwing each other under the bus. As far as villainous henchmen go, I wouldn't classify them as truly evil, just simply as mad as the rest of Wonderland. I'm not going to lump the White Rabbit in with the rest of the guards, however, since he seems to only act as a messenger. He does the least to antagonize Alice, not only out of the Queen's court, but out of Wonderland for the most part. He's got his own crazy agenda to follow and can't be bothered with some random girl who's following him around. The Queen is initially somewhat nice to Alice, at least as nice as she can be for a short amount of time, but Alice knows from the start that she's on thin ice. As with the rest of her adventure, Wonderland as a whole seems to be against Alice, who tries as hard as she can to please the Queen. Thanks to the Cheshire Cat, more on him later, Alice ends up stuck on the Queen's bad side very quickly. Instead of the Knave of Hearts being on trial like in the book, it's Alice who's in hot water. I assume this was an effort to get Alice more involved in the climax, and give the erratic narrative some stakes. Once again, Alice grows to an enormous height thanks to the mushroom she'd pocketed earlier, but in a fun twist, after she brushes the cards aside and stands up to the Queen, she shrinks right back down. This, of course, means she's in even more danger than she was before, and soon has all of Wonderland chasing after her. The Queen has always been quick to call for someone's head to roll, but with Alice, it now seems especially personal. Although the Queen of Hearts might not rank up there with the all-time greatest Disney villains, she's far from the bottom of the list. She's the closest thing the movie has to a true villain, and that's mostly because of the lack of a concise plot. Still, based on what I've read about Disney's attempts to streamline the plot into a more cohesive narrative, none of them sounded like they would have worked. It sounded like they all would have taken away from the magical madness of the original story. Thus, although the Queen is haphazardly thrown in the final act, she really does dominate the scene and make the remainder of the movie her own. I'm sure Her Majesty wouldn't have had it any other way. The Queen of Hearts was voiced by Verna Felton, who can be heard in many other Disney films of this era. Although she was known for playing strong, authoritative roles in film, television, and radio, Disney was still able to let her show her range with her animated characters. Well, we have the unpleasant, blustery roles like the Queen, Aunt Sarah from Lady and the Tramp, and the elephant matriarch from Dumbo. She also played kinder roles like Cinderella's fairy godmother, Flora from Sleeping Beauty, and Winifred from The Jungle Book. Although you still wouldn't want to cross any of these characters, just to be safe. In most of the Queen's future appearances, in cartoons, games, and theme parks, she is usually voiced by Tress MacNeille. Allegedly, her appearance and mannerisms were partially based on Hollywood gossip columnist Luella Parsons. The King of Hearts was voiced by Dink Trout, another character actor who is better known for his work on radio rather than screen. Fans of old Disney cartoons, however, might also remember him as the elderly Boodle Beetle in a few Donald Duck cartoons. Alice in Wonderland was his final screen role. Before moving on to the other villains, I must address the Red Queen from Through the Looking Glass. She is a completely different character in the book, and is a living chess piece on a giant game board. She's not terribly nice to Alice, although few characters in Wonderland really are, but she's not as cutthroat as the Queen of Hearts, and gets along with Alice about as well as anyone else does. She and the Queen of Hearts are sometimes mistaken for each other, thanks to the Disney movies combining the characters. Some of the Disney Queen's dialogue, like when she instructs Alice on how to address royalty, come from the Red Queen in Looking Glass. The Red Queen's line about how all ways belong to her is also paraphrased by the Queen of Hearts. In the book, it's a reference to how a queen moves in chess, while the Disney version reflects the Queen of Hearts' inflated ego. When we discuss the live-action versions of the Queen, we will see that the characters are again often combined. Even in some Disney comics, the Queen of Hearts is referred to as the Red Queen, further complicating things. The actual Red Queen did appear in Donald in Mathmagicland, where she is voiced by June Foray. In a fun little scene, she and the King, voiced by Dawes Butler, chase Donald Duck around a chessboard. And to add insult to injury, Donald finds himself dressed as Alice for the occasion. The Cheshire Cat is the next villain on our list. He is one of the most iconic characters in both the source material and the Disney film, known for appearing and disappearing at will, sometimes leaving his floating head or merely his grin behind. In the book, the cat shows up a few times to converse with Alice. Although he is not terribly helpful, he is generally nicer to Alice than most of the other characters are. The King of Hearts, upon seeing the cat's head appear at the croquet game, reacts in fear. With the Queen's prompting, he calls for the executioner to behead the cat. The executioner refuses, since the cat appears to be nothing but a head at that point, making the job impossible. In the David Hall draft for the Disney movie, the cat was just as sinister and creepy as the rest of the cast. He could be nice at a few points, while devious at others. About halfway through the script, he would have helped Alice escape from a giant, overly playful puppy, a character that was in the books but cut from the movie. However, during the courtroom sequence, he is seen selling programs for the upcoming execution, with an invisible head for the proper effect. Later, he appears to be one of the judges, his grin appearing even more sinister than usual. In the horrifying finale, what appears to be the cat's dead body can be seen hanging from the rafters, just to make things even more disturbing. A different proposed draft from 1945 would have given the cat an even bigger role. Alice's cat, Dinah, would have fallen down the rabbit hole and become the Cheshire Cat. The only way to transform her back would be to speak to the Queen of Hearts. Alice, the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, and the March Hare would have gone on a quest to find the Queen, only for the Knave to frame Alice for stealing tarts. The Cheshire Cat would have managed to prove the Knave to be the guilty party, saving Alice and regaining her identity as a normal kitten because of her unselfish act. As you can see, because of how memorable the Cheshire Cat was in the book, Disney had always intended him to play a big role in an already eclectic cast. But would he be good or evil? The final version leads much more on the malicious side, although if you were to call him out on his behavior, he would probably just give you a big, innocent Cheshire grin. The cat seems harmless enough when we first meet him. Like in the book, he has a little conversation with Alice, and remarks that she can visit the Hatter or the March Hare, but they're both mad either way. When he shows up again later on, his true colors begin to appear. Rather than give real comfort to the distraught lost child, he advises her to visit the Queen of Hearts, and even gives her a shortcut straight to the castle. Of course, the Queen's reputation is well known, as we discussed, and the cat definitely knows what Alice is in for. He goes on to provoke the Queen's anger not once, but twice, and lets Alice take the blame. Unlike everyone else in Wonderland, the cat seems to at least be aware of how his actions will affect Alice, yet he goes out of his way the most to make her life difficult. Although the Queen might be seen as the main villain of the movie, I'd say the cat is the most malicious out of everyone. Setting things in motion and then watching the anarchy play out seems par for the course for a character who's so good at appearing and disappearing at will. The cat is certainly mad like everyone in Wonderland, but he's a different kind of mad. One of his main animators, Ward Kimball, explained that he wanted the cat to stand out in the crowd of wild cartoon characters, so he had the cat's actions be mostly understated and play it cool. He does fantastic things with his body, like literally standing on his head, but all in a very nonchalant way. He at least knows that he's crazy, which is more than the others can say. He just embraces the madness and runs with it. The Cheshire Cat was voiced by Sterling Holloway, who has been heard in many other Disney productions. His most well-known role is arguably Winnie the Pooh, and we'll see him in another villainous role when we get to Kaa the Python from The Jungle Book. In most of the Cheshire Cat's future appearances, he's voiced by Jim Cummings, who has also been cast in a few of Holloway's other roles. The Walrus and the Carpenter are up next. In both the Disney movie and the original Through the Looking Glass, they exist in their own story within a story, as a poem recited by Tweedledee and Tweedledum. In the poem, the two characters are walking on a sunny beach during the middle of the night when they come across a bed of oysters. They lure a dozen oysters away for a pleasant walk, and after traveling for a mile, they enjoy a shellfish dinner. The story has been interpreted as being a parable about corrupt authority figures, either politicians or religious icons. For instance, some believe the Carpenter to represent Jesus, and the Walrus to represent the Buddha, but this is most likely untrue. Like the Duchess of Wonderland, people are looking for morals where there aren't any. Unless, of course, you're an oyster. The Walrus seems to be the more talkative of the two, famously talking of many things, like shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. The Carpenter is more blunt and to the point. While the Walrus talks to the oysters, the Carpenter merely demands the Walrus pass the bread. Neither of them are good people, of course, given that they deceive and devour the oysters, but they both have different ways of going about it. The no-nonsense Carpenter grabs the biggest oysters for himself, while the Walrus sheds crocodile tears over their misdeeds, while discreetly hiding extra oysters he's grabbing under his handkerchief. The Disney version of their story is pretty true to the original poem, while adding some extra slapstick and setting the verses to a bouncy tune. The ending is changed slightly as well. While the adorable oysters do still meet their demise, a rather bold move for Disney, it's the greedy walrus who eats them all behind the Carpenter's back. The two characters have had the personality traits that we glimpsed in Lewis Carroll's poem expanded and somewhat exaggerated. The Carpenter goes from being rather simple to a complete simpleton. The Walrus is even more of a freeloading opportunist. That being said, I like how the Carpenter is shown to be remarkably talented at his profession. In a matter of a few seconds, he builds an entire restaurant out of driftwood and parts of old ships. There's also a wonderful little detail where he slices the loaf of bread using a handsaw. It's really charming. One thing I don't think I've seen anyone else mention is how much these characters seem to have been derived from Pinocchio's Foul Fellow and Gideon. Their appearances, for example. Foul Fellow and the Walrus put on airs, but their tattered clothes and gloves show that they're really just bums. Gideon and the Carpenter are shorter and give off a cute, innocent demeanor, but they're really just as bad as their partners. Both sets of villains are quick to exploit children and actually come away from things pretty well off. Even smaller details are the same, like how Foul Fellow and the Walrus pick up a discarded cigar with their canes when we first see them, or how both Gideon and the Carpenter try to attack their victims with a mallet or hammer before the smarter of the duo stop them. It's pretty fascinating to see just how much was lifted from Pinocchio when you think about it. The Walrus and the Carpenter don't ever properly interact with Alice, but they are seen during the chase at the end at a couple points, along with a few surviving oysters. They're a fun diversion in a movie full of fun diversions, and their sequence is probably my personal favorite. Both characters, along with the oysters and the Tweedles, were voiced by J. Pat O'Malley, a character actor who regularly appeared in the older Disney films. The final villain we'll be seeing before we go into the character's other appearances over the years is the fearsome Jabberwock. He comes from the poem Jabberwocky, featured prominently in Through the Looking Glass. The poem, full of wonderful nonsense words and creatures, tells of a young man who slays the fearsome Jabberwock, a monster that lurks in the Tulgey Wood. The Jabberwock was planned to appear in the animated movie in some shape or form, but it ultimately never happened. One idea was to have the scene play out as a story within a story, similar to The Walrus and the Carpenter. Storyboards for this show a large Jabberwock with a bird-like face. Another version had Alice seeing the creature in the Tulgey Wood. He would appear sinister at first, shrouded in dark shadows, but when we got a good look at him, he would have been a strange, goofy creature with a steaming tea kettle on his head. He was to have been voiced by Stan Freberg. In a Disney children's book published at the time, the Jabberwock does appear on one page, looking a bit like the tea kettle version, with some changes made as well. My favorite detail is that the poem describes him as having eyes aflame, so his eyes are literally drawn as little flames here. The Jabberwock, sometimes mistakenly called the Jabberwocky like the poem, has been a popular character to include in Wonderland adaptations. Even though he never meets Alice in the story proper, his poem and his original illustration are so memorable and striking that he works well as an antagonist. As we'll see later in this video, although the Jabberwock didn't make it into the animated Alice, he would pop up in later media. Plenty of Disney comics have been written featuring characters from Wonderland, although in the grand scheme of things, they haven't appeared quite as frequently as characters from other movies around this era, like Peter Pan or Pinocchio. Generally, the Queen of Hearts and the rest of the villain types are a little more mellow in these comics. The Queen is still blustery and can be a downright tyrant, but she can also be reasoned with, or at least tricked by the other characters, making her less of a threat and more of an annoyance. Sometimes she's even shown to be friendly toward Alice and the others, if she's feeling inclined. Alice herself is a lot more accepting of the madness of Wonderland, so maybe it's more that everyone's just gotten used to each other over her many visits. A variation of the Queen of Hearts appeared in a story starring the good fairies from Sleeping Beauty. In this story, she once again accuses the knave for stealing her freshly baked tarts, and sends the fairies to find him. As it turns out, the king actually snuck a tart or two himself, and most of them had been eaten by the queen in her sleep. The queen was not the ruler of Wonderland here, but rather a small, unnamed kingdom. The Walrus starred in a series of comics printed in the UK, where he would attempt to do good deeds for others, only for them to horribly backfire and enrage the person he was trying to help. The Carpenter would give him a herring at the end, since the Walrus usually meant well. Most notably for the Walrus was a comic adaptation of Through the Looking Glass. In this version, he's the closest thing to a main villain. While searching for the White King's missing crown, Alice encounters the Walrus and the Carpenter in the woods.
Why, I know those two. They're the Walrus and Carpenter from Wonderland. Good day, Mr. Walrus. I think we've met before.
No, it wasn't me. I wasn't there. I'm innocent. It's you. What do you want, dear little girl?
If you please, sir, I'm lost.
Lost, eh? Then let me sell you this excellent map. Only £5.
But I have no money.
No money? Still, I could tell you where to go for, say, £1.
I haven't one penny, sir. Ought I ask a policeman?
Ask her! Child, never mention the word policeman to me. Goodbye.
Alice sees that the Walrus has the stolen crown in his pocket, and chases him through Looking Glass Land for the rest of the story. With the help of the Lion and the Unicorn, she is able to finally recover the crown from the slippery Walrus. A comic published in 2006, simply called Wonderland by Tommy Kovac, was meant to be a proper sequel to the Disney movie. The White Rabbit's maid, Marianne, finds her life thrown into turmoil following the uproar caused by the mysterious giant Alice monster that antagonized the Queen of Hearts. It's a fun read with many new characters, good and bad alike, that draws enough from the Disney movie while also doing its own thing. Like many of the classic Disney franchises, the Wonderland characters have appeared in a number of video games. The first was Mickey Mousecapades, its translated Japanese title being Mickey Mouse Adventures in Wonderland. This game is notable in that the Japanese version was heavily based on Alice in Wonderland, while the American version toned down a lot of those elements. In both releases, Mickey and Minnie are trying to rescue Alice, but the Japanese version has many Wonderland characters appearing as bosses. These characters include the Cheshire Cat, the Tweedles, the Caterpillar, the Walrus, and of course the Queen of Hearts. A notable non-Wonderland boss is Captain Hook. The American version has all the bosses changed. Ironically, another Peter Pan character is added with a crocodile as a boss, but Captain Hook has been replaced with Peg-Leg Pete. The Queen of Hearts is replaced as the final boss by one of the weirdest looking depictions of Maleficent I think we'll ever see. A Super Nintendo point-and-click game called Alice No Paint Adventure was released exclusively in Japan. All the text is in Japanese, and I can't find much information about what the plot is. The introduction shows the Queen breaking apart some sort of orb that causes Wonderland to lose certain colors. The king sends the White Rabbit to fetch Alice for help in repairing the orb. Alice journeys around gathering the color pieces and winds up in the Queen's dungeon for her troubles. Even after Alice succeeds in the quest and wakes up, she appears to still be in her dream world and is chased by the Queen and her guards before waking up for real. An Alice game that did get a proper US release was for the Game Boy. At the end of the game, Alice gets to play against the Queen in croquet. Beating her, of course, ensures her wrath. Players then navigate the hedge maze full of amusingly floppy guards trying to attack, followed by fighting the guards head-on. Luckily, since they're nothing but a pack of cards, they do go down pretty easily. In Disney Villain's Revenge, a game we naturally keep coming back to, the Queen succeeds in having Alice's head chopped off. Although Alice seems to be a little perturbed at worst about the whole affair, seeing her casually headless body is a little jarring at first. Players must venture through the hedge maze to find Alice's head, avoiding guards, hookah smoke, and the creepy muzzle of the Cheshire Cat. At the end, the players battle the Queen herself, along with the guards. Wonderland appeared in several Kingdom Hearts games. The most relevant one for this video is probably the first game, where heroes Sora, Donald, and Goofy must save Alice from the Queen. Alice has been accused of trying to steal the Queen's heart, her namesake no less, and Sora volunteers to find the real thief, while Alice is left locked in a cage. The Cheshire Cat appears several times along the way to give Sora some cryptic advice, but does not seem interested in truly helping the heroes, just in watching them try to figure it out themselves. The thief, unsurprisingly, is revealed to be one of the Heartless. Even with the evidence in front of her, the Queen decides to have everyone executed anyway, leading to a battle in her courtyard. Some manga versions of the King of Hearts games give the cat a chance to really show his mean side, when he encounters a shrunken Luxord, just like any cat would do to something it sees as easy prey. Later, Roxas finds himself imprisoned by the Queen of Hearts, and the cat offers to help him get out of the cage. He does this by throwing a hedgehog at the Queen and making it look like Roxas did it. Now he can get out of the cage for his execution. In KINECT Disneyland Adventures, the Queen is a meetable character, one of the few villains with that distinction. She is haughty as always, but generally nice to the players. She does not allow any hugs, though.
Handshakes only. Hugs, never.
In the Alice in Wonderland level, the players are used as croquet balls by Alice and the Queen. For this game, instead of Tress MacNeille, the Queen was voiced by April Winchell. Speaking of Disneyland, it's natural that such a fanciful setting like Wonderland would be well represented at the Disney theme parks. One early idea that would have featured our beloved villains was for a walkthrough attraction, something of an elaborate funhouse. The Walrus and Carpenter could be seen inside their restaurant, the Cheshire Cat would appear and disappear for guests, and near the end, guests would pass through a maze made of playing cards in the Queen's courtroom. Instead of a funhouse, an Alice in Wonderland dark ride opened in 1958. This original version only had one villain make an appearance. The Cheshire Cat would cackle down at guests from a footstool as they passed through the oversized room, where everything was huge. In 1984, the ride was fully redone, and also featured the Queen of Hearts, her royal guards, and the King, among many other Wonderland denizens who were left out of the 1958 version. Near the end of the ride, the guests would enter the Queen's gardens, where the cards are busily painting roses and marching around. The Queen initially appears looking friendly, but of course flies into a rage in the very next scene. Her royal executioner appears next to her, readying his axe. Of course, the guests make a quick escape. In this ride, Tony Pope supplies the voice of the King of Hearts and the Cheshire Cat. Disneyland is the only Disney park to have an Alice Dark ride, but Disneyland Paris has an elaborate hedge maze that reuses a good deal of the ride's designs for the characters within. The Angry Queen figure, for example, now rises from behind a wall to threaten guests who pass by. Her castle is the centerpiece of the attraction, with the King proudly standing on the balcony. In Tokyo Disney, the Queen of Hearts Banquet Hall is a lovely restaurant. Outside, the gardeners are once again painting the roses red. Inside, the Queen and King can be seen surveying guests, acting much more welcoming than they usually do. Of course, walk-around characters and meet and greets are a staple of Disney parks, and with so many characters to choose from, it's natural that a good deal of them have been seen over the years. The Queen of Hearts, imposing as always, has appeared often. In fact, she was the first character I ever met as a child. I think I'm holding it together pretty well in these photos, but I was actually terrified at the time. The King has appeared less frequently, and has mostly been in parades as opposed to being meetable. The first variation of his costume, from the 70s, was bulky and very cartoonish. A later version, seen in the past 15 years or so, was probably a lot easier to move around in. The Cheshire Cat has surprisingly not made many live appearances over the years. To my knowledge, the only place where guests can meet him somewhat regularly is Disneyland Paris. Although the Carpenter, as far as I know, has never been a meetable character, the Walrus was actually out pretty frequently around the 70s. He can be seen with the other Wonderland characters in many promotional photos and postcards. Although his costume has been updated since then, his appearances have generally become more sparse. For the final section, we'll delve into a few of the live-action versions of the story that Disney has worked on. None of these have been direct remakes of the 1951 movie, but are alternative takes of the characters, sometimes drawing just a bit of inspiration from the animated versions. First is the beloved Adventures in Wonderland TV series from 1992. This fun, whimsical show generally softened most of the main characters. Although they still all had their own madcap quirks, they were generally much more agreeable and friendly. The Red Queen, played by Armelia McQueen, fitting name, was really a combination of the Red Queen from The Looking Glass and the Queen of Hearts. Unlike the animated Queen, this Queen was much more reasonable and kind, in spite of having a temper and a somewhat childish demeanor. Ultimately, she would always do the right thing at the end, and sometimes even acted as a voice of reason when things went off the rails. The Cheshire Cat, a puppet played by Richard Kuhlman, was a generally harmless prankster, and had his own hidden soft side. The Carpenter never appeared, but the Walrus did, played by Ken Page. Once again, he was much kinder than his animated counterpart. The show did have the Duchess as a recurring semi-antagonist played by Terry Garr, but she and the Red Queen were ultimately friends at the end of the day, in spite of their bitter rivalry. The only two real villains I can think of were one-shot characters. Copycatter Hatter was the Mad Hatter's second cousin twice removed. This Hatter was a plagiarist, stealing his cousin's hat designs and passing them off as his own. He was played by the Mad Hatter's actor, John Robert Hoffman. The other villain was Mike McNasty, played by Gilbert Gottfried. This appropriately named bully used to pick on the March Hare in high school, relentlessly throwing pies at him. It appears that he never aged out of it either, coming back to torment the Hare, who has to learn to defend himself. Then there are the characters from the 2010 Alice in Wonderland movie. Although this movie is sometimes lumped alongside the live-action remakes that have recently swept Disney, I don't really think it belongs in the same category. To me, this movie is a completely different take on Wonderland. It just happens to be made by a company who also did an animated version of the story 60 years prior. In this movie, the Red Queen is the main villain, once again combined with the Queen of Hearts. Helena Bonham Carter plays the bulbous-headed, tyrannical ruler of her kingdom, who wants to take over all of Underland, this movie's version of Wonderland. Assisting her is the Knave of Hearts, played by Crispin Glover. In addition to her army of cards, she also has some powerful creatures at her disposal. The Bandersnatch and the Jub Bird, both voiced by Frank Welker, and the dreaded Jabberwocky, voiced by Christopher Lee. The sequel, Alice Through the Looking Glass, had Alice's spurned fiancé, Hamish Ascot, go from being an unpleasant mismatched snob to a cutthroat business rival to Alice. He's played by Leo Bill. Lastly, there's the Once Upon a Time TV series and its spin-off, Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I never really got into either of these series, although I'm told that Once Upon a Time was good, especially the first 3 seasons. As I have in previous entries, I'm only mentioning these here for the sake of completion, since most of my focus has always been on the original animated villains. And to take the transparency further, I'll admit that for these particular series, I am just getting the information from fanwikis. The Queen of Hearts is played by both Jennifer Coig and Barbara Hershey, and is the mother of Regina, the Wicked Queen from Snow White. In flashbacks, she's played by Rose McGowan. In Once Upon a Time in Wonderland, the Red Queen is named Anastasia and played by Emma Rigby. She apparently has similarities to Anastasia Tremaine from Cinderella, who appeared as a different character in the main series. You can see why this is a little confusing to someone who's never watched these shows. And there's also the Knave of Hearts, played by Michael Sosha. That should cover the villains in all the Wonderland media by Disney. Alice in Wonderland was not an instant success upon its initial release, which must have been frustrating for Walt Disney given how long the movie had been in development. However, over the years, audiences have come to appreciate the film's wacky, nonsensical, occasionally deranged world. The villains are a lot of fun, and they perfectly fit into the adventures underground. In the next entry, we'll be looking at another adaptation of a classic British children's story. Captain Hook, Mr. Smee, and more assorted pirates than you can count await us in Neverland. For this video, I want to give a big shout out to the blog Vintage Disney Alice in Wonderland, which compiles lots of great Alice merchandise, comics, concept art, and magazine clippings. Without it, I don't think I would have found that great Looking Glass comic with the Walrus. Definitely check it out.
The time has come, my little friends, to talk of food and things.
A peppercorns and mustard seed and other seasonings. We'll mix them all together in a sauce that's fit for kings. Kaloo-kalai will eat today, like cabbages and kings.